Okay, so this is part 2 now of this chapter 10, first day of CV diagnostics. So just make sure that when you are, I'm going to be sending you links to the YouTube video so you can have the audio part with it. The one that's actually on Blackboard is just the plain PowerPoint without the video. So I have made a few changes to this PowerPoint. I've just added a couple little things like a video link. So this one is the current one that I'm doing the audio off is the most update one. There's a couple of minor changes. So we're moving on to the vascular system. So when we talk about the vascular system, we look at systemic and pulmonary vasculature. Okay, sometimes you'll hear systemic referred to as peripheral, but for I'll try to stick with just the word systemic. Okay, that gets a little bit confusing when the P, when you're using an abbreviation with P, whether you're talking about pulmonary or peripheral. So we'll just try to stick with systemic. All right, so this is another review as far as how the circulatory system flows. So again, if it helps you to draw out a picture in like 2 more slides, you'll see the picture from Egan. It's like I said, this came from chapter 10, so you can follow along if you have the book or if you have it online. So when we talk about the systemic, we're looking at the systemic vasculature. We're looking at it beginning with the aorta on the left ventricle and then travels throughout the body and then returns back up to the right atrium. Okay, so that's systemic vasculature. So that's your first blank there. Pulmonary vasculature, being your second blank, then begins with the pulmonary trunk out of the right ventricle and then comes back into the left atrium. The systemic venous blood returns to the right atrium. Okay, so as it comes back to the body, it comes in from the inferior or superior vena cava. Remembering superior being above, so that drains from the upper extremities in the head, and then the inferior drains the lower body. And then the blood then flows through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Okay, so you want to look at, again, a slide ahead, 2 slides ahead here. So tricuspid valve then is your fill in the blank for your third blank. All right, so then after it gets into the right ventricle, then it's pumped from the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary artery, which then carries it to the lungs, okay, to be oxygenated. And then the pulmonary artery, so that's where the only time we kind of have it flip-flop, where arterial in this case is non-oxygenated as it carries it to the lungs. And then veins then are actually oxygenated because the pulmonary artery blood returns via pulmonary veins back to the left atrium. Then the left atrium has the oxygenated blood now, and that flows through the mitral valve into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle pumps the blood through the aortic valve into the systemic circulation. Okay, then the blood passes through the systemic capillary beds back into the capillary veins and then comes back through the superior and inferior vena cava. So just a quick review on your fill in the blanks on this particular slide here. So you have a pulmonary valve is your first blank. The second one is left atrium. And then the fourth bullet there you have aortic valve into systemic circulation. So when you listen to this, you might be able, I'm trying to think, because there are some little notes that I put on the bottom. I'm not sure if you're able to view them in this way, but with regular PowerPoint you're able to view them. I'm not sure how it looks with the YouTube video, so you might want to refer to the Blackboard version of it too to see if those notes are viewable. Otherwise, I will be saying everything too. So, all right. So as we're looking at this diagram that I was referring to, and this is in your textbook, if we look at the left side of the picture, at the left blue arrow there on the top, that's going to the left lung. Okay, so that's your pulmonary artery, and then it splits basically coming off your right ventricle. There you have the left and then the right. So you have one going to the left lung, one going to the right lung. Okay. And then the red then are your pulmonary veins, the both lower vessels there on both the left and right side, returning back to the heart from the lungs being oxygenated. So keeping in mind that the right side generates about 25 millimeters of mercury to drive the blood through the low resistant, low pressure pulmonary circulation. So it generates about 25 millimeters of mercury of pressure. Okay, so it's a lower pressure because it doesn't have to travel as far. It's just going to the lungs. Okay, so the left side of the heart doesn't have to work, or the right side, I'm sorry, the right side of the heart doesn't have to work as hard as the left side of the heart. So the left side, on the other hand, has about 120 millimeters of mercury, which is your normal systolic pressure. So it's a higher pressure because it has higher resistance. It has to travel further. Alright, so we're going to be talking about systemic circulation here for a little bit. There's three different parts of the systemic circulation: the arterial system, the capillary system, and the venous system. Okay, so when we talk about the arterial system, this is also referred to as the conductance vessels. Okay, the conductance vessels. So these are large, elastic, low resistance arteries. So they help transmit and maintain the head of pressure generated by the heart. Okay, so low resistance, they're large, they help keep that blood going out. And then there's small muscular arterioles, those are called the resistant vessels, and their major role in the distribution and regulation of blood pressure by varying the flow resistance. Okay, so their major role in the distribution and regulation of blood pressure by varying the flow resistance. So they're kind of like faucets, they control the blood flow into the capillaries. And this is, again, broken down really well in your textbook if you need some, extra support. Your capillary system then is where your microcirculation happens, and those are your exchange vessels. So that's your second fill in the blank word, is exchange. And that's where the transfer of nutrient waste products occur. And then your venous system is also referred to as your capacitance vessels. So capacity, basically. So I'll spell it for you. C-A-P-A-C-I-T-A-N-C-E. Capacitance. I suck at pronouncing. Anyway, capacity. That's where a lot of the blood is being held, basically. Okay, it's the reservoir for your circulatory system. It generally holds about 3/4 of the body's blood volume, and then it conducts the blood back to the heart. Okay. All right. So the venous system must overcome gravity to return the blood flow back to the heart. So there's different mechanisms that help that return. The sympathetic venous tone is one of them. The skeletal muscle pumping, or the milking, which is combined by the one-way valves. Okay, so your veins have those one-way valves. The cardiac suction, okay, which is kind of like Frank Starling's law. So this is kind of talked about on page 215 in Egan's. And then the thoracic pressure differences caused by the respiratory efforts. so the thoracic pump. And this is where we have to be mindful with positive pressure ventilation, especially with hypovolemic patients and cardiac failure patients, that we can impede that venous return, by having that positive pressure inside the intrathoracic cavity. So we have to be mindful of that. All right, this is just a little picture. Basically, this is found on page 216. It's the components of the microcirculatory network. So just kind of showing up a kind of close up there of the of the capillary system. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. All right. So the systemic vascular system then is the sum of all opposing forces to the blood flow through the systemic circulation is systemic vascular resistance. So your SVR is equal to the change. Remember, change is often represented as a triangle, delta, okay? Change in pressure from beginning to end divided by flow. So overall, resistance, if you put it in a mathematical equation, resistance is equal to pressure divided by flow. So the change in pressure. And the change in pressure that we're going to be talking about, and the flow that we're talking about, is the difference between your MAP, so your SVR is an equation again. So it's your MAP, or your mean aortic pressure, minus your RAP, or your right atrial pressure. Okay, so you put that on the top part of the division problem, basically, or fraction, or however you want to say it. So you have MAP minus RAP, both the line underneath it, divided by CO, cardiac output. Okay, so there's your change in pressure. So when you think of the systemic, you're going to have the mean aortic pressure. Okay, so that's going to be your higher number. So mean aortic pressure, let's say, of about 90. And then if you have your right atrial pressure, so you're looking at the beginning of the system, so that's the beginning where it's coming out of the aorta, and then travels through the body, comes back to the right atrium. And then your right atrial pressure is about 4 millimeters of mercury. So if you do the math there, you've got 90 minus 4, which is 86, and then divided by 5 as an average cardiac output. These are normal values, okay? That's going to give you equal 17.2 millimeters of mercury per liter per minute, okay? So that's one way of looking at the values, okay? But it's generally represented in dynes per second per centimeter to the fifth. And that, the way they get that number is then they multiply it by 80. 80. You multiply it by 80 to get to dynes per second per centimeters to the fifth. And that's usually the unit that they're going to use. So a normal then SVR in your dynes is going to be 800 to 1200. Okay, so you'll see that in the book in Egan's. You also see it in Wilkins. So remember that conversion. All right. So just a couple things I wanted to say more about abnormal values for your SVR. So an abnormally high SVR would indicate peripheral vasoconstriction, which happens as a response to hypovolemia. So if you're hypovolemic, you don't have that much volume, your body recognizes it, and then it vasoconstricts the vessels to help maintain blood pressure. And in an abnormally low SVR is showing that there's some peripheral vasodilation going on, which can actually occur in septic shock. Okay, so a high SVR, you've got some vasoconstriction going on, so you have more pressure there, and that's how your body is going to respond to hypovolemia. And if you have a low SVR, that can be a response from being septic because your body vasodilates. All right, pulmonary vascular resistance, okay, is your PVR. So your pulmonary vascular resistance, kind of pretty much the same concept here, just looking at some different numbers, okay? So it's the sum of all opposing forces to blood flow through the pulmonary circulation. So this time you are looking at, again, the change in pressure divided by flow, because that's how you're calculating resistance, but you're using your numbers as your mean pulmonary artery pressure minus your left atrial pressure, and then you're dividing that by your cardiac output. So you have your MPAP minus your LAP, and then a line with cardiac output below the line. So if we look at those numbers, so an average mean pulmonary artery pressure is 16. These are some average numbers, and your LAP would be about 8. So if you take that and do the math, divide by 4, you get 1.6. Okay, but keeping in mind, then you times that by 80. So a normal PVR is about 100 to 200, generally less than 250. Keeping in mind, again, is going to be a lower number because the pulmonary vascular system is a lower resistance system. Okay, so thinking of things that are going to change it or make it high, for example, so abnormal high PVR could be indicative of pulmonary hypertension, hypoxia, lung disease, or a PE, pulmonary embolism. Okay, so abnormally high PVR could be indicative of pulmonary hypertension, hypoxia, lung disease, or a PE. PVR increases, again, with a decreased PaO2, big A, a decreased pH, and an increased PCO2. So your pulmonary vessels are constricting in response to the hypoxia, the hypercapnia, and the acidemia. And like I mentioned, things that are going to increase your PVR include emboli, sclerosis, destruction of the capillary bed, and compression of the lung by a hemo or a pneumothorax. So on page 216, it actually has the correct equation on there, with it being the cardiac output times SVR. Multiply those together, then add your CVP. But like I mentioned before I had to edit this, we're more familiar with the systolic blood pressure plus 2 times the diastolic pressure. I have 2 mouses next to each other, and I keep making the mistake of touching the wrong mouse. So sorry about that. All right, so page 216, but be more familiar with the systolic plus the 2 times the diastolic, and divide by 3, and then understanding the mean arterial pressure is directly related to the volume of the blood in the vascular system and inversely related to its capacity. All right, time to move on to a different slide. Okay. So when vascular space decreases, okay, when vasoconstriction occurs, okay, so that makes sense. So we're constricting the vessel, we're making it smaller, so obviously the space is going to decrease, and then so that is going to actually then cause our blood pressure to increase, even though the volume is the same. But that's how our body kind of compensates for that. And then on the flip side, as our vascular space increases with vasodilation, okay? So there's relaxation of the smooth muscles, then that causes the blood pressure to decrease even though the blood volume still has not changed. So certain things, situations like sepsis, can actually kind of make the blood vessels dilate even though we don't want them to. I do want to talk about a hemodynamic, non-invasive hemodynamic monitoring system. We generally don't use invasive measurements as much as we used to. So, and I know I talk about this a little bit further in a couple of the PowerPoints coming up in the next few days. But the Cheetah NICOM is a non-invasive hemodynamic monitoring system, and it helps look at fluid responsiveness and helps to guide volume management. So I know I have some videos on it to look at the manufacturer and how it helps guide fluid management without putting in a swan or a CVP. So they may use it in places of sepsis, or you're in shock, hypovolemia, low cardiac output, low vascular tone. The other types of patients they can use it in are neurogenic shock, where you've had central nervous system damage, like head trauma or spinal cord trauma, surgical patients, post-op patients, ER trauma patients, ARDS patients, acute kidney injury, CHF patients, and history patients in renal failure or on hemodialysis. So I'll have some video clips related to that coming up in the next few days. Alright, so our normal mean arterial pressure ranges from about 100 or 80 to 100, okay? So remember, it's volume divided by capacity, basically, is the concept behind it. If we have a mean arterial pressure, sometimes that'll be a number that the doctors will look at. Depending on how their blood pressure is, it's all over the place. They're having a hard time keeping the systolic at a certain number. They definitely want to keep the mean pressure above 60, because if it falls below 60, then you're looking at possible damage to brain and kidneys. So they're definitely going to be compromised, and that organ failure can occur in minutes. So there's a bunch of different ways that this is controlled. It's a complex array of integrated functions. And I'll kind of touch on those here in the next few slides. Okay, so the heart basically works as a demand pump. The cardiovascular system may alter capacity, how much blood it can hold. So the vascular system tells the heart how much blood it needs, rather than the heart dictating what volume of blood the vascular system will receive. So this is on page 217 out of Egan, and I thought that was interesting. So the vascular system basically tells the heart how much blood it needs, rather than the heart dictating what volume of blood the vascular system will receive. Keeping in mind, the decreased capacity results in greater venous return and greater cardiac output. So we have a decrease in volume, and then our blood pressure is actually going to go up to help maintain our cardiac output. Okay, so the cardiovascular system really tells the heart how much to pump, and it does this by local and central control mechanisms. Okay, so really the heart plays a secondary role into regulating how much blood is actually being pumped or flow. I mean, it controls the pump, I guess, as far as how much, how fast, and stroke volume, and that by things that we're going to be talking about here coming up. So blood flow through large veins can also be affected by abdominal and intrathoracic pressure changes. Okay, so just remember, the vascular system tells the heart how much blood it needs, rather than the heart dictating what volume of blood the vascular system will receive. so regulations of the peripheral vasculature. So normal level of vascular muscle tone is maintained throughout the vascular system at all times. So we have local control and central control. So the local control is the myogenic control. This involves the relationship between the vasculature smooth muscle tone and the perfusion pressure. Okay, so myogenic control is your first blanks here. So this basically ensures a relatively constant flow to the capillary beds despite changes in perfusion pressure. And then metabolic control involves a relationship between your vasculature smooth muscle tone and the level of local cellular metabolites, so such as high CO2 or lactic acid, a low pH, a low partial pressure of O2, then causes relaxation of the smooth muscle and vasodilation, so it can increase flow to the affected areas. And then the central control is achieved by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Alright, so regulation of your cardiac output. So this is what I was thinking about before when I was kind of stumbling there for a minute. We're looking at cardiac output is your heart rate times your stroke volume. Okay, and our normal is about 5 liters. Okay. So your end diastolic volume is the blood that's left in the ventricles just prior to contraction. So by the time the relaxation or diastole ends, each ventricle has filled up with blood. This amount is the EDV, or your end diastolic volume. The amount of blood ejected during systole, or during the contraction phase, is the stroke volume. So at the end of systole, the volume of blood remaining in each ventricle is your end systolic volume, which is on the next slide here. Okay, so then you have your end systolic volume is your blood left in the ventricles after your contraction. So there's a small amount of blood left after that contraction. So the heart does not eject all of the blood it contains during the contraction, and that small amount of blood that is left then is your ESV. During the relaxation phase, the ventricles fill then to a volume called the EDV, which was on the previous slide. So the difference then between those two, the difference between the EDV and the minus ESV then is your stroke volume. And your stroke volume is determined by your preload, your afterload, and your contractility. Okay. So just going back up a little bit there about the cardiac output is related to the heart rate. We have to keep in mind that if our heart rate's too high, we're not going to have enough filling time, and that's going to result in a decrease in your EDV, which is your end diastolic volume. Your EF is your ejection fraction, your stroke volume, and then there your cardiac output. So in a couple days you guys are going to get well, you can look at it whenever you want, I guess, but it's coming up in probably day 3 or 4, I can't remember exactly. It's going to be a table that you're going to complete, and it's going to have all these different volumes in it, and PVR formulas and everything that you can write all the normals and what it means and all that stuff. So you'll study for that. That'll be something that you'll fill out to use as a resource. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit here. I'm going to be talking for actually a while now about stroke volume, preload, afterload, and contractility here, probably close to the end of this PowerPoint. I'm trying to move on. I'm getting kind of wordy here. Okay, but preload these are definitions that you need to know. Okay, so preload is the amount of blood present in the ventricle at the end of diastole. Okay, so this should be stuff that you hopefully went over in think it's AP116, I'm not sure. Cardiac AMP. And then your afterload, I always think of afterload as a door. Okay, so afterload is like, so think of you're trying to open up a door and someone's pushing on it on the opposite side, preventing you from opening it. Okay, it's giving you that pressure, so it's giving you that resistance. So the afterload is the pressure against which the heart muscle has to work. Okay, it's the forces that impede the flow of blood out of the heart. So you're trying to push open the door and you've got this force on the opposite side pushing against you. That's your afterload. And then the contractility is basically the strength of the cardiac contraction. Okay. So when we look at our numbers here of EDV minus ESV equals stroke volume, normal values approximately, your EDV is about, this is a normal healthy man at rest. The EDV is about 110 to 120. And then your ESV would be about 40. So if you do the math of using 110 minus 40, normal stroke volume is approximately 70 mils. This is milliliters. A little bit. And this is again out of your textbook. I'll try to go over this quickly. I feel like I'm talking way too much tonight. So this is just kind of defining what's going on here, the regulation of your cardiac output and how your body responds to different things, depending on how much is in each chamber at the time. Okay, so we have a normal relationship there in A is being represented with their between the EDV, ESV, and stroke volume. Okay, when you're looking at B, you have an increase in stroke volume resulting from an increase in your end diastolic volume, which makes sense because you've got more there to work with, so your stroke volume's up. C is showing an increase in stroke volume resulting from a decreased end systolic volume. And if you're looking at normal EDV and ESV, I have notes here that I wrote. Atria is like near the EDV, that's in your atria, and then normal ESV I have ventricles written down. Okay, and this is explained on page 218 in your textbook too. C then is showing an increase in stroke volume resulting, I already said that, sorry. D is a decrease in stroke volume resulting from hypovolemia, basically would be an example of D. Okay, so you have less volume to work with, so you have a lower stroke volume. And then E then is showing a decrease in stroke volume due to a increase in your end systolic volume is left over because you have poor contractility. Okay, so that's just kind of what that whole diagram is. I sure hope it's recording because I just had negative numbers down in my area where it's showing how many minutes I've been talking. Okay, we only have about 10 slides left, so hang in there. Like I said, Desjardins does a good job with this on page 237. So it talks about, I just kind of like their little take on it a little bit. So ventricular preload then refers to the degree the myocardial fiber is stretched prior to contraction at the end of diastole. The greater the stretch, the greater the myocardial contractility. Okay. So the greater the preload, the greater will be the volume of blood in the heart at the end of diastole. And there are certain factors that affect preload. And let me see if I put that on the next slide. This is just basically showing you have the greater the stretch as you go to the right on this. The x-axis, as you travel to the right, your stroke volume is going up at the same time as your stretch is going up. So, I do want to say, and I'm believing it's coming up here, but I want to just mention it before I forget to. Factors that affect then preload are venous return, total blood volume, blood volume distribution, and atrial contraction. Okay, so factors that affect preload are venous return, total blood volume distribution, and atrial contraction. So the filling pressure of the heart at the end of diastole, or the left atrial pressure at the end of diastole, is what's going to determine your preload. I apologize if I'm repeating myself at this slide, but it looked like it wasn't recording again. I'm having a little technical difficulties here. So contractility then is the amount of force the myocardium produces at end diastolic volume, okay, at any end diastolic volume. So again, I have preload in the parentheses here. And then increased contractility results in a greater ejection fraction for any EDV, which is called positive inotropism. And we look at positive inotropes are drugs that are going to increase the contractility of the heart muscle. Okay, so that's your fourth blank there. And then the last one is negative inotropes, then they're going to decrease the contractility of the heart muscle. Okay, this is a diagram that you'll find on page 219 in Egan, and it's basically explaining a hyperdynamic heart on the where it says decreased afterload, increased contractility, increased heart rate. It's saying what a hyperdynamic heart would be like, with normal being in the middle. It should say normal there in the it doesn't in the middle curve. So a hyperdynamic would be a given preload results in a greater than normal cardiac output. Factors that contribute to this would be a decreased afterload, increased contractility, and increased heart rate. And then on the lower end there, where we have an increased afterload, decreased contractility, decreased heart rate, would be something that we might see in CHF, where your pumping efficiency is so low that your cardiac output is not adequate. All right, so we have different things that are going on here as far as the integration and local and central mechanisms to make sure that everything is kind of balanced out, basically. How we're trying to keep the blood pressure in a normal range. So your normal, hold on, somebody's at my door. So again, normal local control is a primary determinant. With large changes in demand, central control then becomes primary. So the central control is in the medulla, and that is also your autonomic nervous system. So the precapillary vessels is controlled by the first part there, the vasoconstriction and vasodepressor. That's your precapillary vessels, and then the cardio accelerator and your cardio inhibitory, those are more for your heart. Okay, so we have this little balancing act basically going on here in this diagram, and this will be at page 221 in Egan. So what we're looking at here is the central control of the cardiovascular function occurs again by the interaction between the brainstem and selected peripheral receptors. the brainstem is receiving constant feedback from these receptors about what's going on with the body, with the pressure, the volume, and the chemical status of the blood. So if we start on number 1 there, which is kind of on the left side, sort of towards the middle, I guess. So we have a stimulus then, which is going to perhaps increase then our blood pressure. Okay. Then the baroreceptors in the carotid sinuses and the aortic arch, then they are stimulated. Okay. So then the impulses from the baroreceptors stimulate the cardioinhibitory center, okay, and then the inhibitory vasomotor center. Hold on one second. Okay, so we're on the top of it now, on 3. So then we have the impulses from the baroreceptors. They stimulate the cardioinhibitory center and then inhibit the vasomotor center. So then it helps balance it out. So initially, all of a sudden, everything starts to go up, and it's creating an imbalance. And then, after those centers have been stimulated, then the sympathetic impulses to the heart rate cause then the heart rate to slow down, decrease our contractility, decrease our cardiac output, and then we come back to hopefully baseline there on number 5 on the right side. So we're looking at the top part of this seesaw, I guess, and it helps them bring down the cardiac output and decreases the respiratory rate also, and we try to maintain homeostasis. Okay, and then the flip side happens then if we're looking at the bottom part of the curve or bottom part of the diagram here, where we have some type of stimulus that decreases the blood pressure, then the baroreceptors in the carotid sinuses and the aortic arch are inhibited, and then these impulses from the baroreceptor that stimulate the cardioaccelerator. Okay, so before it was the cardioinhibitor centers, now the cardioaccelerator centers are being stimulated, and then that is going to lead then to increased sympathetic impulses to the heart, which is then going to lead to increased heart rate, increased contractility, increased cardiac output, which then also is going to vasoconstrict. We're on the top side. I think I forgot to mention it's going to vasodilate. Okay, it's actually, yes. And then as the heart rate then increases, after the sympathetic has caused it to increase the heart rate, then the cardiac output and everything turns back to normal. Yes, your R is your respiratory rate, your respirations. So that is that diagram. All right, so now we're talking about, again, the peripheral receptors, those baroreceptors. So when you think of baroreceptor, baro, you think of like barometric, so you're thinking of pressure. Okay, so baroreceptors respond to pressure changes. In the first set, there are in the arch of the aorta and the carotid sinus. So they monitor our arterial pressures that are generated by the left ventricle. Okay, the second set on the arterial walls, large thoracic and pulmonary veins, these are low pressure, so they respond to volume changes. So your baroreceptor output is directly proportional to your vessel stretch. So the greater the blood pressure, the greater is the stretch, and the higher the rate of neural N-U-R-A-L, neural discharge to the medulla. So the negative feedback system works as the greater the stretch causes venodilation and decreased heart rate and contractility. So these are basically trying to balance out each other by activating chemical and hormonal mechanisms. That's how this is working. I know this is a lot. This would be one of those kind of lengthy days of PowerPoint talking. Almost done though. So again, these are located. So the chemoreceptor, okay, sorry, the one before was the baroreceptors. So now we're talking about the chemoreceptors, and they are also located in the aortic arch and carotid sinus. They respond to changes in our blood chemistry. So, so a decreased PaO2 provides a strong stimulus, and a low pH and a high CO2 also does what it stimulates it to do is to increase the heart rate and increase the respiratory rate. So to increases output by vasoconstriction and increases the heart rate. Generally, chemoreceptors usually have little influence under normal conditions. So just as a side note. So this usually only happens when it's overtaxed. Okay. This is on page 223 in Egan, just to kind of help clarify, because I'm sure it's kind of confusing and overwhelming. So oh, I know, I remember this part now. This is what happens when we have changes in volume, okay? Respond to changes in overall volume. So, like, for example, if we have a hemorrhage, okay, that being the most common. Okay, so with 10% volume blood loss, the immediate decline in central venous pressure causes so with the 10% blood volume loss, there is there's an immediate decline in the CVP, which causes a 50% decrease in the discharge rate of the low pressure baroreceptors. Okay. So the initial response then is if the sympathetic discharge then increases the heart rate. Also, your ADH begins to rise, which is your antidiuretic hormone, which is vasopressin, which is naturally occurring, and then normal blood pressure then is maintained. So it's kind of how the body is responding to this hemorrhage. If your blood volume loss reaches 30%, then your blood pressure is going to fall, and your aortic baroreceptors now increase their output, as long as there's no further blood loss. Then they can hopefully maintain the blood pressure. All right, this I believe is our last slide. So this is on let's see, page 224 in your textbook, and it's basically just kind of showing what's going on as far as when you're in systole, diastole, how it's equivalently matching up to the volume that's going on in your blood, how it's matching up to the frequency of related sounds, the heart sounds. So if you're looking at the bottom of the chart, E is representing the volume of the blood, D is representing the frequency of related to the heart sounds, how they're amplified. C is basically an EKG strip or ECG tracing. B then is looking at the different pressure changes that are being reflected, and then A is actually the timing of events when we have systole and diastole in the atria and the ventricles and what's happening. So good job hanging in there. I know it was a little bumpy there, had some technical difficulties, but look through Egan and Desjardins to kind of help support you with this.